So hi guys, so 2 videos ago we had a little play with some paint and we did it on the airbrush. In this video I'm going to be doing a more of an introduction into paints, how to use them, what the different paints are, and how to deal with, I'm going to approach this from an unknown point of view from paints. So we'll be doing a little bit of backtracking because we have used an airbrush and now I want to use a brush, but this is my introduction to paints. Okay guys, so obviously it's really nice to use an airbrush. It's so easy, it makes life so much easier, but there will be times when painting with an airbrush is not an option and we have to get the old paintbrush out. So for the purposes of this video I'm going to go to this, which I did some zenithal highlighting on, and I think this will be a really good example to sort of play about with some paints. So first thing you'll notice, I've got lots of paints in front of me and these are all different brands. Now different brands handle differently, they're different thicknesses, obviously they're different colours. You'll get very similar paints with different names, and it's all very confusing. Now what I understand about the naming of the paints is sometimes they may have a registered trademark. This one, for example, this is Citadel Mephiston Red. I believe Mephiston is something to do with Citadel, so you couldn't now make a Mephiston Red, but basically this is an ordinary red, no different from Tamiya, I think it's XF7. But the first question we've got is what's the main difference between the paints. Now, because each manufacturer is providing you a paint to do a different job, it will obviously be set up for that job. So for example, going back to this Citadel, this is primarily designed to paint Citadel figures. Citadel do a range of 3 different paints. They have base paints, layer paints, and then they have other ones like technical, they have edge paints, etc, etc. Now this is a base paint, so this is slightly higher pigmented, which means you're going to get a nicer coverage. It means that instead of doing say 3 or 4 layers, you may only need 2, but it is a thicker paint. Now I don't have a layer paint with me on me, but a layer paint looks exactly the same, but it's not so heavily pigmented. This is designed to lay down first to give us a nice base colour, hence the name base, and then you will put layers over the top of layer paints, and because the layer paints are thinner, not so heavily pigmented, this base colour of red will show through and will enhance the top layer. Tamiyas are more designed for scale models, so they're a little bit different. Now I find these a lot thinner. Now I'm told that you can't they don't thin well with water, whereas these are excellent with water. I get the impression these paints are designed for a younger audience to be introduced into the world of figure paints, so these are designed to be used with water. These are obviously for the more experienced, inexperienced and experienced. I personally like to thin with thinners. So yeah, you've got hum rolls, again that's designed for scale models. You've got model colours, as the name suggests, they're designed for models. We've got this one. I've never ever used this one before. I don't even know who makes this one. Monument Hobbies, and I think this is more for figure painters. yeah, like you see, I've never used it before. I can't even get the lid back on. Oh no. So this is my favourite ones at the moment. This is AK. Now this is Air Series, not to be confused with things like Model Air. The Air Series means that it's aircraft colours, not that it's designed for an airbrush. We've got a MIG ammo by MIG there. We've got a Tagliari, so these are probably more designed for scale models. Scale colour, these are actually designed more for figure painters. Figure painters love these. We've got Hataka. These I believe are more designed for tanks, so the colour match to provide for tanks. This is a company called Roots Model Paint. Now these guys copy Humbrol paints, and I actually like, this is the first one I've tried. We were trying to look for a particular colour from Humbrol, we couldn't find it, and I found this, and this is actually quite a nice colour. In fact, if anything, it's better than Humbrol. This is Colours of War. This is MRP or Mr. P. I don't know if it's Mr. P or MRP. These I'm slightly confused with. I'm told these are lacquer based, but there's no mention of any lacquer unless they do a lacquer based version, and see they're non-toxic, so I get a bit scared to use this. Now these are Cote d'Arms. These are the old Citadel colours, so they're pretty much like the Citadel. So the first question you've got is, how do I deal with them and how do I thin them? Well, the short answer is experience. You will use paints, you will over thin them or not thin them enough. You'll make mistakes and you'll learn from the mistakes, but we need to look at these as though we have no experience of painting and we have no idea how to thin them. So what I'm going to do is do a little bit of a, we'll look at how to the sort of consistency we're looking for, and then we'll paint with some of them, and then we'll go for them. So I'll try this one first because I know this is going to be a thick paint. So what we can do is, I like to use a tile, but you need some kind of palette. Equally, you could use this as a wet palette. Don't worry if you don't know about wet palettes, I will cover it in the series at some point. But in a nutshell, this is a palette that can be sealed, it's got a bit of moisture in it, and it stops the paint from going dry, so you can come back and use it the next day. So this yellow, I was painting with this yellow about a week and a half ago, and as you can see, it's still wet. So wet palettes are handy if you're doing big projects that you know you're not going to finish tonight. You can pop some paint in there and it'll still be ready to go in the morning. So especially if you start mixing different colours, this is an accidental mix, it flowed together, but you can see that red and yellow makes orange, so I could perhaps palm that off as I was looking to blend from red to yellow and all various colours in between. But for today we're going to just use an ordinary tile. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my Mephiston red, or I'm going to just call this a Citadel base colour for the purposes of the video. Now you'll see that some come in dropper bottles. Didn't clean that very well, did I? Never mind, I've got dirty fingers now. These come in bottles, these come in dropper bottles. I personally prefer the dropper bottles because, like this one for example, this is brown leather by Scale Colour, and then all I need to do, give it a good shake, and then I just put onto my palette what I want to use, and that's not been mixed very well, as you can see. That's very, very watery. It is actually a very thick paint, and it's also extremely matte. And I suppose I should introduce some varnishes. We'll call them a paint. They are in effect, they're a paint because they've just got no colour in them. So I'll talk about, while I'm shaking this, I'll talk about the composition of paint actually. Essentially what paint is something like this. Now this is a matte medium. And what this is, it's not the same as varnish, but it's basically just paint. That's all it is. Whoops. It will dry clear. This is quite, but it's paint, but it's got no paint in it, no actual colour in it. Not varnish is a little bit different. Now, if you were to add pigment to that, you would end up with a paint, and that's basically what it is. And you see that this medium, you see how thick it is. So that would most definitely need thing. In fact, let's play with that to start with. That'll just give me a bit more time to shake this. So what we'd do is we'd add some thinner to it. We'd gently mix that together, and I know it's hard to see because it's white on white. You see it's now a lot more runny. So it's now going to be a lot easier to work with. If you painted with that original paint, can you see that you've got, it's quite lumpy, and this is a lot thinner. So it's obviously going to be a little bit better to work with. So hopefully this is shaken enough. That's a lot better. So there we have a fairly thick paint. If I bring it this way, you can see that it does actually sit above the surface. So because that's quite thick, we're going to add a lot more thinner to it. So I'm adding roughly about as much thin as there is paint. And then what we'll do is we'll mix that together, and then that's struggling to mix. Right, so take the excess off our paint, and then we'll just paint a little bit of the palette with it, and we'll see how it paints. Now I personally think that's a little bit thick, so I'll add a bit more thinner to it. I have a tendency to over thin my paints, but it's better to over thin than to not thin at all. And I'm going to be chucking some buzzwords at you in a little bit. One of the buzzwords is self-thinning, self-leveling. Now, what basically happens, I might have to get my pen and paper out to demonstrate. That's a lot better. So you can see that when I paint with this, I can get a nice smooth line, and that's kind of the consistency I'm looking for. So you can see I did add quite a lot of thinner to that. Now let's take something that I know is going to be a lot thinner. In fact, let's take Tamiya. So this is Tamiya Flat Black. Flat just means matte, and you'll see straight out of the bottle, that's quite nice to work with. Straight out, look. So it doesn't really need anything. I personally don't trust a paint that you don't need to thin, so I may be tempted to just add just a tiny bit thinner. And whilst that's probably a little bit over thinned, I would find that much easier to work with. There we go. So nice and thin. So why is it important to have thin paint? So when you paint, looking at it as a cross section, it's going to be bumpy, and that's where the the bristles has laid it down not quite thin, not quite straight. Now gravity is going to make that all level out, but at the same time the paint is starting to dry. So there's a little bit of a race against time. Now, if it's thick paint, which this is still fairly thick, it's going to move a lot slower, and then as it's moving it's going to get thicker and thicker as it dries. As it starts to dry, it lays a bit of a skin on the top, very similar to school custard. Remember the old days of school custard, and you get this thick skin on the top. Now that's a little bit like paint. Now if it's thinner, it will move faster. It's like comparing liquid clay with water. Water is going to flow. If I just put some cleaner on because it's blue. So there you've got some blue cleaner on there, and look how fast that's moving around. So that's going to naturally level out. I'm going to have to clean this before I use it because I've now put airbrush cleaner in there. So by having thinner layers, it means it's going to level a lot quicker, and then if it levels before it dries, then obviously it will be a nice flat coat. So the trade-off obviously is that the thinner the paint, the less coverage we're going to get. So we will end up having to do an additional layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Mephiston red and I'm going to paint something without thinning it. Then I'm going to get the same Mephiston red and I'm going to thin it, and then we're going to see the difference. So let's find something. Let's find something out of my box. Right. So here I have a piece of tail plane from an aeroplane. I have no idea which aeroplane it is. And I'm going to take my Mephiston red. And there he is, look. Thick and gloopy. So that's actually going to be a really, really good test, because that is very thick. That's been in that bottle a long time. So here we have some thick gloopy paint, and this is an absolute extreme. You would never use paint this thick, and if it was a brand new bottle it probably wouldn't be that thick. But so let's do this end first. So as you can see, look, the coverage is very good. Very good coverage. That's nice and thick, and that's covering that in one go. There we go. There we go. I don't think we need a second coat on that, do we? Do you see all the brush marks on it? Now because it's so thick, it's not going to be able to level. So it's going to dry like that, and it's going to take longer to dry. So what we'll do is we will take our paint. I'm just going to wash my brush out a bit. Right, so we're going to take our paint and we're going to add possibly too much thinner to it. We're going to make that paint nice and thin. Really, really thin. I think I've added way too much thinner, but it's going to take it to the other extreme, which is nice thin paint. We're not going to go wrong with this. So take a little bit on our brush and we're going to paint. It is a little bit too thin, so there we go. We won't go all the way to the line. Right, so you see our first layer is on. Now we've got absolutely terrible coverage, but look how smooth it is. So much more smooth. That first layer is still drying. This second layer, that's almost ready for the second coat. I wouldn't dare. Now let's just as an experiment, if we now paint our second layer onto the first one, you can you see that that's made an absolute mess of that? All it's done is just pull that half dried paint across. But that first layer, that's ready for second coat. Because it's so much thinner, it's dried quicker. So what we'll do now is we'll add a second layer on, and I'm not going to go all the way. I want you guys to see the difference that each layer is going to make. Now, coming from figure painting, anyone who's done figure painting will have heard the expression two thin coats. Two thin coats is always better than one thick coat. Personally, I end up doing three thin coats because I do tend to over thin my paints. But look, I've now put a second layer on. Look at the coverage I've got with that second layer. Still nice and smooth. Look, we've got all that detail. Still got a little bit of detail there, but can you see the difference between the two coats? This is the thick coat. That's terrible, and I've made an absolute mess where I've pulled that second coat on too early. This has got two coats on it. Okay, the first coat is quite thin, see-through, but look, that second coat has gone down lovely. So I think you can already begin to imagine what the third coat will be like. And I haven't really lost much time by doing thin coats and having to do additional coats, because look how much quicker they're drying. Now, this paint is drying rather slowly. I will explain my thinners at a later video, but this has got a substance called paint retarder in it. I make this primarily designed for my airbrush, because there's a lot of air going through the airbrush. It does dry the paint a little bit quicker, so I do put a little bit of paint retarder in there, paint drying retarder. It just stops it from drying so quickly, just to counterbalance the alcohol and the air in the airbrush. So obviously the trade-off with that is that when I'm brush painting, my paint's going to take a little bit longer to dry. But I think that second coat is just about ready to have the third coat on it. And let's pop the third coat on. I'm doing this quite quick. I'm not doing this as neatly as I would, but there we go. So there's our third coat of paint on, and that's pretty much as good coverage as one coat of thick, but look at the difference in the finish. And it's not a perfect job anyway. So I think the lesson that I've managed to show you there is that thin coats is going to do the job better than one thick coat. Now obviously it depends on the paint. This has taken 3 coats. I know from personal experience that these scale colours tend to be quite thick. Tamiya will probably do the job in, well, I thin them, so it'll probably do it in 2 coats, but quite often you can do it in 1 coat. Model colours are very similar in that you only probably need 1 or 2 coats. A lot of these are quite thin, these Instar, and I don't see them being really popular paints. These have been, I've had this for quite a while. Hitakas are quite nice to work with, but these are my new favourites. So do you know what, I've never actually used this colour, dark Prussian blue, so I'm dying to give it a go. So I think this is going to be quite similar to the Citadel, and it's going to be, well, it's a fairly thick paint. I've used them slightly, but not this colour. Okay, so I've got a little bit of the Prussian blue down. I'm going to add a little bit of thinner, not too much, probably not as much as I did last time, although if you, oh, that's really nice. I like that. Sorry, this is the first time I've ever used this colour. As you see, the thinner's trying to run away. So I am dying to use this colour. Yeah, I do like that red. So let's so there we go. So as predicted, the colour on one coat isn't a perfect colour, but that's how I paint. It's nice and thin. The other thing I should have mentioned is, if you feel you need to go over the paint again, really do resist the temptation until you know that that's fully dry. As you see, it's not a great coverage on one coat, but look how quickly it's dried. That's practically dry. So now obviously if you're doing something like figure painting, you might be doing 10 figures. So you'll do one figure, then you'll do the next, then the next. By the time you finish the 10th one, you go back to the first, it's all ready to put the second coat on. So I'll start putting the second coat on. And do try to paint in one direction. It's not always possible. See, like I really want to do that first bit a second time, but I'm not going to because it started to dry. I'll put that on a little bit thick, but like much better coverage. That's practically there on 2 coats. So right, so that's using the paints, and I'm going to keep this Prussian blue out because I want to go on to the figure that we zenithal highlighted. And hopefully this is going to demonstrate how the paint is going to work with different colours. So you see that I've zenithal highlighted this. I want to paint the cloak. I did actually want to paint the cloak with this Prussian blue. Now if you're doing figure painting, when they do the paints, they do them in sets of 3, and you'll find you've got a deep base colour, and then you'll have a main colour, and then you'll have a highlight colour. I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to use a dark Prussian blue, and I'm going to use this RAF Azure blue. I'm using it as a dark blue and a light blue, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my deep dark base colours with Prussian blue. Then I'm going to add a little bit of the RAF Azure blue. You know, you can use a darker blue. If you use a white, it's going to lighten it very, very quickly. If you're using a light blue, it's going to give you a larger margin for error. But all I want to do, I want to give it a nice base coat of this nice Prussian blue, and you'll see that underneath there it's black, on the top there it's white, and what we're hoping for is that where it's black, it's going to come out a very dark colour, and there you can see it's almost still black. Just going to colour all of that cloak in. It's quite difficult because there's a lot of detail on this cloak, and to get it into all of the crevices. Now as we hit the grey areas, we're getting more of the natural dark Prussian blue, and then as we hit the higher lights, we're getting a nice bright colour. Okay, so let's finish this bit off. So what this this zenithal highlighting has done is acted as a guide to tell us where we want to be hitting the darker shades and where we want to be hitting the lighter shades. So That's half of the cloak done. So we'll see there, look, I've got this really nice, and it's actually darker on camera than it is in real life. There we go, there's a nice shot of it there. And underneath, it's very dark. It's a completely different colour actually. But yet you've seen me, I'm using the same colour. So I'm going to carry on painting this, and I'll come back when it's finished, when I've done the first coat, and then we'll talk about doing the second coat. Okay, so I've finished painting that cloak and I've let it dry. Now if we look at places like this underneath, it's only got one coat on it, and to be honest with you, because we've got the primer on it with the different colours, I think one coat is all we need, because we're going to be adding additional steps. But as you see, look, it's gone quite dark underneath, but if you look on top, it's extremely light. And this is where the white hit it, and this is where the white missed it. So I'm liking that colour. This is starting to dry on the palette. This is one of the problems with using a palette. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add in just a tiny drop of blue, of a lighter blue. And I've put a little bit to one side so that I can thin this paint, get it down to the consistency that I want and the colour that I want. That's nice. And then what we can start to do, because we don't, at this point, we don't know how this is going to affect it, so we'll just bring this in. I think that's probably about there in one go. So we'll mix all of that together, and we're making just a slightly lighter shade, and make sure that's nice and thin. And then what we'll do is we'll work this paint in exactly the same way that we did the previous colour, but what we're going to do is we're going to avoid the very, very dark bits. And we've got our little guide. We can start to see where it's lighter, and then what we'll do is we'll hit the raised surfaces only. And then that starts to give us some depth. Now if we were to hit this exact same colour over where we hit the exact same colour, it will change the colour a little bit more. So we're just hitting the higher areas. Now I can see now that there's going to be quite a harsh colour change. It's a little bit what we call cartoony. So what we can always do is we can always add a big colour over the top to blend it all in together. So you see that I'm not going all the way down. I'm not doing the deeper recesses. Almost to the bottom, but not all the way. And now it's starting to add some depth. Obviously the more I do this, the less it becomes applicable for scale models and more for figure painters. Actually this is working quite well. So if you imagine where the sun will be coming, that's the areas where the sun will hit. that's the areas that we want to hit. So now adding to starting to add. Now the head, we're going to almost pretty much completely paint that with the brighter colour, just leaving any really deep recesses. Okay. So you can see we're starting to force some highlights and some lowlights. Now, because we're using really thin paints, what I want to do, I want to go over them again with exactly the same colour, but this time I want to leave even more behind. So I'm not going to go quite so deep. So we're not quite painting over all of it again. And one thing I forgot actually, when I painted the last layer, I thought there was going to be some quite steep colour changes, but I actually forgot that as it dries, it darkens. And if you thin the paints a lot, much heavier than this, it actually won't affect the colour too much, and then you can put in more layers to subtly change that colour. So you see I've not gone quite as much as I did before. There we go. So building in some highlights there. Because we have that nice dark base coat, it's adding the depth to the top coats. So what I want to do now, I want to introduce even more of this lighter colour, probably about the same amount as I added before. So we're going to take it up a stage, and we can do this as subtly as we want. You can add a lot less of the light and maybe do this over 5 stages rather than 3, but I'm just doing it at a nice basic level. So keeping the paint nice and thin. You know, you could better to over thin it than it is to under thin it. So there we go, we've got a lighter shade, so you can just see round about there, that's the original colour. That's the extreme light colour, and this is the colour we're left with now. So just clean our brush off a little bit. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to hit those really sharp lines. You see the sharp lines on the coat, on the cloak. So along the edges. This is why we call it an edge highlighting. Just catch those really sharp edges. And I'm not going right underneath. I'm trying to keep coming in from a more of a 45-degree angle, just like we did the grey primer. We're just going to hit those higher highlights. Does that make sense? I'm going to avoid underneath the cloak altogether. So this bit I can hit because there's an upper surface. I think that's probably the easiest way to explain it. Upper surfaces. Yeah. And then maybe down the middle of the, there we go. Now as that dries, that will darken a bit, especially if it's really thin paint. We've really forced those highlights. And we're always using the colour underneath. We want the original Prussian blue to be showing through that extreme colour on the top. And then what we can do thin it if you want. I'm working with quite a strong colour here. If you're working with a not so strong colour, then no, it'll work a little bit different. This is a little bit down to experience. Right, so you're still using that same same colour as I did on the last layer. I'm just going to hit some of those highlights again, just to strengthen the colour that I've got. Remember that each layer that you add, the more you're just going to slightly lose, sorry, the original base colour of the dark Prussian blue is going to become slightly less influential. So I want to go a little bit sparingly on this. There we go. You notice also each layer I'm using less paint. And then what you might want to do, depending on how hard you want to hit those highlights, you might want to use your original light colour, really thin it down almost to a glaze. See, like I've got a lot of thinner in there, and I'm not pulling in all of the paint. And then you can use that, and you can just really push just a few, just touch on a few highlights. Just the extreme ones. Just add in a few points of interest. Now that looks very extreme there, but once it dries it will darken off. This is nearly 100% thinners. This is more glazing than painting. There's so little paint involved. But you see, I'm not hitting all of the highlight. I'm just hitting some really sharp points. Okay. If I had painted this little bit there, I'd run my brush along the top. So there's two things that's influenced the colour. One is the primer that we've used. Like you see, we've managed to get that really dark underneath, and we've got it really light on the top. So the highlight there is much lighter than the highlight there. It's probably a little bit too much paint there. So if I can just pull some of that off. It's not a problem. If you've gone too far, you can just get some of your darker paint, just put it to one side, and we'll add a little bit of thinner. And then we can just adjust it. It is possible to bring it back. There we go. It's just brought that down just a little bit. It will darken a little bit as it dries. So there we go, guys. So that's basic painting with a paintbrush, and what you're using is all the things that would be light. So to recap, you see underneath there is quite dark. Underneath, if you're looking at the stone pillar now, underneath there is quite dark, and on the top there is white. Now if you add in an even layer of paint, you're still going to keep that light and dark, as we did with the cloak. You see underneath the cloak is quite dark. It is blue, but on the top it's actually quite light, and it's because of the primer and the fact that the paint is thin. So I really enjoyed that. I've not done figure painting in absolutely ages, guys. So and you can just have a play. So I want to add just a little bit of highlight onto the end there, not too much, probably a little bit thick I mean, just on the very point there, and just go with it as much as you want. You know, if you go a little tiny bit too far but not way too far, it's quite easy to pull back. But sometimes it's just tiny spots that will make the difference. You see the point on those that I've created on that cape, just gives it a three-dimensional look. You see how things just start to, so at the moment your eyes are I mean obviously none of the rest of it is painted, so your eyes are drawn to that cloak because it's three-dimensional. The whole model is three-dimensional because of the primer, but obviously the cloak's now added some colour, and that's what's called adding some interest, where it's the different colours. So I hope that that's a good basic introduction to paint. I've tried to be, let me change my camera, I've tried to be quite generalised on it, because if I gave you, if I used one particular brand of paint and I said this is how you use AK Interactive or this is how you use Citadel, then all I've really done is given you a lesson on how to use that particular brand of paint. What you're looking for is a consistency. Another good way to tell if you've got a good consistency is to paint on something awkward. So let me go back to my camera. So right, this is still quite thin. So on a piece of kitchen roll with nicely thin paint, can you see that I can paint quite a nice line. Okay, so if I now get, where's that Mephiston red? Because that would be a really good example. I mean, this is obviously to an extreme, way too thick. But if I got some Mephiston red out of the pot and I paint, it's actually not going too bad. But also another way to tell is on a piece of paper, or on the back. In fact, let's do the back of the hand method. Let's do the back of the hand method, or with a glove on, and it will show you the difference. And red would be really nice with a black glove on. So I'm going to go straight out of the pot, and see, the trouble is this is actually painting quite nicely straight out of the pot, and we always tell you don't paint straight out of the pot. See, that's kind of disproving my theory here, but hopefully this will work better. So I'll put some paint onto the palette and I'll give it a bit of a thin. It's very hard to demonstrate when doing it wrong is actually working quite well, but that's me for you. I could have practiced this off stream before I did the video and it would all have gone wrong. So I've got this thin to a nicer consistency. I'm loading my brush up and that is actually painting quite nicely. Oh, sorry guys, I've done that off camera. So let me do it on the palm of my hand. So with it thinned down, can you see how the paintbrush is holding the paint so much better? And this is all in one brush stroke. It's just flowing off the brush nicely. Now for reference, this is a size 0, so it's actually not going to hold that much paint. Look how thin it is, yeah, compared to straight out of the pot. It's a really nice consistency. Now straight out of the pot, this will do it now, won't it? Let's see what we can get with straight out of the pot. Yeah, that's doing it exactly as it should be doing it now. Yeah, brilliant. That's exactly what I wanted. So that it's a lot less control, the line is thicker. Yeah, so thin the paint, and I can do some nice precise strokes. Yeah, look, this is going on forever. Forever and ever and ever and ever. Nicely controlled, nice thin lines. I mean, this is a size 0, so you're not going to get tiny lines, but with nice controlled paints you could probably get thinner lines with a size 2 than you probably would with a size 0 not thin. So this is not thinned paint. This is straight out of the pot. That's 4 lines. It's really starting to lose control now. It's all stuck in the brush. Okay, so hopefully that demonstrated how much better the paints are. I mean, I've been painting for a while, so I can appreciate a good paint more. But a good painter will be able to get a better result with a bad paint that's thinned properly than they would a very good paint that's just straight out of the pot. Obviously a good paint, I want to look at this. I seem to remember these Instars being seriously thin. Yeah, I've been thinning this paint. I will just give a quick introduction to the paint palette. The way that a paint palette works is it has this this wet, it has moisture in the bottom, water, thinner, whatever you want to use. It then has a sponge which is going to soak up the water. You see there when I squeeze it, there's water come out, and then you have a piece of, it's essentially baking paper, not greaseproof paper, because you want the moisture to come through, but it stops the foam stops too much water from coming through. And then what you'll do, straight out of the pot, you can put your paint straight onto the paint palette like so. So we've got our nice thick paint there, and then what we can do is we can work the paint into the palette, and each time you're pressing on that, it's then going to draw, it's going to draw the moisture up. So you've got, if you use it properly, what you can do is you can work the moisture in. Now this part of the paint is quite thin and this one is quite thick, so I can actually paint with this. So and then this part is still thick, so you can see I'm slightly better on this side. So working the thin paint in, get it nice and thin, and then yeah, thick paint. So but this takes a lot of practice, and I've not used it that much. You can thin directly onto the paint, and then the excess will just I didn't mean to do that. Accidents happen a lot when I've got my camera running. And I don't know how it works, but it tends to draw one way. Look, you see there's no paint on the actual foam, but we can draw the paint up. And now that I've got that nicely thinned, you see that's a lot better to paint with. And then I can put the lid on this, leave it overnight, and I can come back to it tomorrow. So this yellow paint that I used last week, I think it's about a week ago that was used, so that's not too bad. Could be better, but we use the red. And of course, because you're on a piece of baking paper, I can blend the colours together, and I'm not ruining the brush. It's pretty much like usually, you know, when you have oil paints on a palette, but oil paints dry very, very slowly, whereas acrylics dry very quickly. So guys, so I'm going to disappear now, finish the video, because as you can tell I've got a little bit of cleaning my hand to do. And as I say, I hope that is a good introduction to paints. Obviously, using the paints that I've used, the way that I've used it, it's more suited for painting parts, or in this particular case figure paints, figures. But bear in mind that it's always better to over thin, as you see from the first what did I do from this, you know, putting that firm. I'll give you another. That's had a bit of time to dry. So this is the layer that I did unthinned with one coat, and you can see that I've made a right mess of it. This side I've had to do 3 layers of paint, but look, each layer is nice and thin. Probably wants another layer, but you know, which one do you like best? Do you like the one layer straight out the pot, or do you like 3 nicely thin layers? And that blue's quite nice actually for 2 coats. Obviously I should have given it slightly bit more time to dry. One other bit of terminology I want to teach you, something that I mention quite a bit, and that's drying and curing. Now when I say drying, I mean that the paint is dry enough to apply a second coat. So this paint on this paint palette is obviously wet. Can you see that this paint is wet? This paint actually, that's dry. Now if I was to do anything with that, this probably isn't going to work, because it never works on camera. This is dry, but it's not cured. If I was to apply a bit of tape, I'm hoping this is going to work. There we go. So you see how that tape has pulled the paint up, and that's because it's not cured. The top layer is nice and dry, look. Yeah, it's definitely dry, but it's not dried right underneath. This was actually quite slightly wet and tacky. So curing, it kind of, the easiest way to sort of describe it is it's going to take overnight. You need to give it time to fully dry all the way through. I could paint over this with no problems. It's not going to affect the bottom layer, but because it's not dry, it's just dry. So 2 words I'll often use, one is to dry and one is to cure. So with paints, although they look dry, as you can tell from this, they're not ready to work with. and I found that out to my peril on another model where I painted it, then I masked it off and did some other painting, pulled the masking tape off, and it pulled all the paint. So when you paint, always leave it overnight to cure. Now this will cure a lot quicker than this because the paint there is thinner, but yeah, I'll leave it at that. So guys, next week I'm gonna just I think next week we'll talk about brushes. I use primarily I use two brushes. This one is my basic base brush, and I use this for slapping down paint. Just want to get a layer on, I'll do it with this. This is a different brush. This has got it's made of Tequniques Sable. It's a much better paintbrush for painting a good top layer. I've also got oil brushes, synthetic brushes, and I just want to give you a basic introduction next week into painting, into brushes, and then I'm going to go off the rail a little bit, and we're going to talk about thinners, cleaners, and water, and we're going to make some as well, and I want to just go through the different brands that you can do, and the pros and cons of making your own. For example, it's a lot cheaper, but the outlay costs are more expensive. Anyway, I'm going to finish this video now, so thank you for watching. Hope that it's helped you a little bit. If you have any further questions, if you feel there's something perhaps I haven't covered, one particular area, pop down a question. I can always talk about it in another video, or if I feel it's a big enough thing to make a separate video on, then I'll make a separate video. Okay guys, so take care, and I will see you next week when we will be talking about paintbrushes. Take care. And I will see you next week when we will be talking about paintbrushes. Take care. Did that work? That hasn't worked.